Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about the film version of Once Were Warriors, directed by Tamahori, which is based obviously on the novel Once Were Warriors by Alan Duff, which I did a video on earlier, and you should see a link in the top corner for that video. Those of you who watch my channel regularly, if there are any such people, will know that I don't normally do film reviews, but when I did my video on the Alan Duff novel, I got a comment asking for a film review, and since the movie had been on my to-watch list for a while, I decided to go ahead and do it. Because I have read the novel, and I had thought, and I had done the video about the novel, a lot of my commentary in this video will probably compare the film and the novel, so be prepared for that. That being said, I think this is actually a really brilliant film. I think it's excellently shot on a low budget. I think it's really dynamic. I think it captures a lot of the energy and the spirit of the book, with a couple of major exceptions that I think are really significant. But the thing that I think is most interesting about the film, so I'll give you a very brief plot summary, so you can sort of get a sense of this. So this film is set in 1990s New Zealand. The characters that we follow are a family of Maoris, the Hekes. Beth is the mother. Jake is the father. Gracie is the daughter. Grace or Gracie is the daughter, and she's the sort of main child that we're concerned with. We have Nig, who's the oldest son, who's largely sort of gone off and joined a gang and is basically living with them. Then we've got Boogie. He's the sort of second oldest son who gets taken away to Child Protective Services, basically the New Zealand equivalent of Child Protective Services. And then there's two younger children who don't really have developed personalities. They're just sort of there to be small children. So the Hekes have very little money. They live in an impoverished urban area full of crime, full of violence, full of alcoholism, and Jake himself is an alcoholic. Beth is not necessarily a full-blown alcoholic, but she's fairly close. Jake is also extremely abusive. He regularly beats Beth severely, and we have implied at one point that he does actually rape her as well. So their family life is problematic. Jake seems generally quite happy with his life, where he's going out and drinking and partying and fighting and things like this all the time. Beth is discontented, but for the most part struggles to get out of this cycle. And Grace, who again is the sort of central child whose perspective we get, is largely disgusted by this whole sort of culture of violence, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, etc., etc. At one point, during a party at the Hekes house, Grace, who's upstairs in her bed, in the same room that her little siblings sleep in, she is actually raped by Uncle Bully, who it's not clear that he's actually her uncle, but she's raped by this man who is her father's drinking companion. This, compounded with cycles of abuse, cycles of violence, cycles of alcoholism in the household, leads Grace to hang herself in a tree in the backyard, which psychologically breaks Beth. Jake's reaction is interesting, and I'm going to talk more about Jake in a little bit because I do find him a very interesting but distasteful character. Beth decides that she's going to take Grace's body back to her sort of ancestral house. So that earlier in the film, they actually drive out and sort of look at where she was raised in a much more traditional Maori environment, which is where her family cemetery is. And we learn that Jake is extremely resentful of her family because they were wealthy, privileged Maori, and his family had been slaves. So he's not keen on the idea of Beth taking Grace's body back for a funeral there. So Jake basically sort of leaves the household, and he's just sort of living this life of constant alcoholism in the bar. Beth finds a note that Grace had written where Grace had said basically that Bully had raped her, and so Beth comes to the bar with her oldest son Nig, the one who's in the gang, to accuse Bully of this crime, at which point, after they convince Jake, Jake basically beats Bully almost to death, including stabbing him several times with a broken bottle and stomping on his genitals. And then the film ends with Beth putting all of the kids in the car, including Grace's friend Toot, who had been living in a broken down car before Beth basically adopts him. And they drive off, leaving Jake screaming and crying outside of the bar as police sirens are heard. So it's a brilliant film that does a lot of the same kinds of things that the novel does. And if you watch my video on the novel, you'll see some of these same themes. The thing that I think is really, really good about the film is it captures the deep ambivalences that mark so many of these characters' experiences. And actually, that was the thing I was most concerned about going into the film, because so much of the novel is about characters' emotional processing, about their attempts to come to grips with what's happening to them. And so Jake, I think, is actually a really interesting character in that sense, because what I find so fascinating about him in the novel is that he's simply incapable of making sense of his emotions. The only emotions that he can really understand are the urge to violence, which becomes his sort of overriding urge throughout most of the latter portion of the novel. Obviously, the drive to drink, and then lust. Those are basically the only emotions that Jake is capable of processing. And when Grace kills herself, he can't come to terms with it, not because he's resistant to coming to terms with it, but because he's so, I guess, emotionally illiterate that he just doesn't have a lens for processing that pain and that sense of loss that he experiences. And actually, I think that in the film, we get a really brilliant portrayal of this. The actor's name is Tamahori Morrison. He actually, I think, does a really good job of giving us this internal struggle through Jake's facial expressions, through his physicality and things like this. this sense that this is a character who is conflicted and doesn't know how even to start approaching that internal conflict. So that's what and we get the same thing with Beth, who's played by Rena Owen. We get the same kind of thing with a lot of the characters. This great acting that gives us the internal conflicts of these characters that are really portrayed from the book. That being said, there are some changes in the film from what happens in the book, and I think some of them are really significant. So one thing is that, actually I think this is the most significant change. In the novel, after Grace kills herself and they take her body back to Beth's ancestral house, they see this sort of funeral performance by the chief of Beth's tribe, and that inspires Beth to sort of start teaching the neighborhood kids about Maori traditions and Maori heritage. And so it's very much a communal effort to rebuild a Maori mindset in this space of urban desolation, this space of sort of modernity that has, at least in Alan Duff's reading, very little to offer the Maori as a people. In the film, we don't have that. We get some hints of that, but in the film, at the end, it's Beth making a sort of independent, individual decision to take her children home. And it's not really specified what she means by home. We can read this as back to their house, which she said she's going to stay in and sort of work to improve conditions for the Maori in their neighborhood. Or it can mean sort of spiritual home of Maori tradition, Maori culture, etc., etc. But it is it's not rooted in a collective attempt to rebuild a cultural identity in the way it is in the novel. And while I get the dynamics of that for a film, that it's much easier to do it that way, and we've been following Beth as an individual protagonist, to me, I actually feel like that is a big downside of the movie. I would much rather, and maybe it's my personal preference, but I'd much rather have had that sense that this is a communal rebuilding rather than an individual woman's crusade for uplift. The sense we do get of communal improvement is actually with Boogie's storyline. So Boogie gets taken to this boys' home near the beginning of the film, and in the novel he basically gets taken away, and then really not much else is heard from him. We get a little bit of information about what happens to him, but mostly he just sort of disappears from the storyline. In the film version, we get much more information about his story. In particular, the social worker who's taken an interest in him from the beginning of his case is training the boys and the young men in this boys' home in Maori traditions. So he's teaching them the haka. He's teaching them to fight with the taiaha. And actually, there is a great line in the film, which I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but at one point, Boog steals the taiaha and starts smashing the windows because he hates being in this social services system. And basically this social worker knocks him down, takes the taiaha off him, demonstrates its proper use in this really impressive martial display of traditional Maori fighting techniques. And the great line is something like, "You think your fists are your weapon, but I will teach you to use this, and then you will carry your own taiaha on the inside." And it is this great sort of line about internalizing cultural traditions. The other element that the film builds in that I think is really important in terms of that community sense is at the funeral itself, at Grace's funeral. Because in the novel, Nig has decided to stay with his gang, and they hang out, and he has fairly disappointing sex with a woman, and they do drugs, and they're drunk, and there's a dog fight, and things like this. So he does that instead of going to Grace's funeral, and he feels quite bad about that. In the film, Nig, and also Boogie, and Toot, they all, like everybody who had been part of Grace's life except Jake, basically comes to this funeral to pay their respects. And there is this much more sort of, it's a rebuilding of family more than it is a rebuilding of community, but it works, I think, along the same kinds of lines. So that's another thing that I actually think works decently well in the film. The other big change that I want to talk about with the film is that we know who rapes Grace in the film. The novel, and this is actually one of the really interesting, problematic things about the novel, is that it's not clear who has raped Grace, because she closes her eyes. So she doesn't know who it was. She thinks that it's her dad. She thinks that it's Jake. And that's what she leaves in the note when she kills herself. And so in the novel, Beth kicks Jake out because of this accusation. And we don't have it confirmed one way or the other. It's Grace's suspicion, but we're not sure. And actually that, interestingly enough, sort of leads Jake to his redemptive storyline, because he becomes homeless, he becomes an alcoholic, etc., and he's living in the park where he meets this orphan child and basically starts sort of sleeping with this orphan child and protecting this kid. Not like having sex with this child, just like sleeping with him, huddled together for warmth. And that sort of becomes his emotional turning point. Like he starts to become a genuine human being, capable of feeling empathy and love for others. And we don't get that in the movie. So that's a little bit sad in a way. But in the movie, again, we have Bully, who's Jake's drinking companion, who rapes Grace. And it's an incredibly difficult scene to watch because we actually see it taking place. We see the confusion and terror on Grace's face. Grace, played by, I'm not going to pronounce this right, and I apologize in advance, Mamangaro Kerbel. Great performance. We see the confusion, the pain, the terror. But that also, the fact that we see that, again, it makes a lot of sense for a film. You're already having the rape of a child, which is going to be incredibly difficult for audiences to handle. To make that incestuous rape, in addition, I can see where if you're directing a movie, if you're writing a movie, you want to take that step back. But that does also reduce a lot of the ambivalence of the novel, or the ambiguity of the novel, which is such a driving force in Alan Duff's book. So again, it makes a lot of sense why they did it that way for the film, but I feel like it's a bit of a loss.